The wilderness holds mysteries that unfold in the most unexpected ways, revealing connections between humans and animals that defy our understanding. But nothing could have prepared Sarah Mitchell for how a moment of mercy during the harshest blizzard in Pinecrest Valley's history would return to her life, transforming not only her future, but the delicate balance of an entire mountain ecosystem. Winter in the Northridge Mountains had always been beautiful but unforgiving. Sarah knew this better than most. For 17 years, she had watched the seasons change from the windows of Evergreen Lodge, the cabin she had once shared with Thomas, before cancer claimed him last spring. At 58, Sarah had grown accustomed to the rhythms of solitary mountain living, the crackle of the wood-burning stove, the whisper of pines against the roof, the distant howls that echoed through the valley on still nights. Snowflakes drifted silently past her window as Sarah brewed her morning tea, her weathered hands wrapping around the warm mug. The meteorologists on her battery-powered radio warned of the approaching storm system, the worst in decades, they claimed. But living 8 miles from Cedar Falls, Sarah had learned to prepare for isolation. Her pantry stood well-stocked, firewood neatly stacked on the covered porch, and the generator recently serviced by Henry Dawson, whose farm marked the last outpost before the true wilderness began. "Just another storm," Sarah murmured to the empty kitchen, the sound of her voice startling in the silence that had become so familiar since Thomas left. Yet something felt different about this approaching blizzard. The birds had gone quiet too, early, and even the persistent chickadees that usually fluttered around her bird feeders had vanished. By afternoon, the gentle snowfall had transformed into stinging pellets driven by howling winds. The temperature plummeted as darkness fell, turning Evergreen Lodge into an island in a growing sea of white. Sarah secured the storm shutters, checked her supplies once more, and settled by the fire with her knitting, a scarf she would donate to the church bazaar come spring, if spring ever managed to penetrate this frozen world. The wind's pitch changed around midnight, rising to a shriek that seemed almost alive in its intensity. Sarah added another log to the fire, the dancing flames casting long shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. Thomas's old cuckoo clock, wedding gift from his parents, ticked steadily on the mantel, a comforting reminder of continuity in a night that seemed determined to erase all boundaries between earth and sky. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, Sarah dismissed it as branches scraping against the porch railing, but there it came again, higher pitched and distinct from the wind's bass roar. She set her knitting aside and moved to the window, wiping away condensation to peer into the swirling darkness. The security light she'd installed last summer cast a feeble glow across the snow-laden yard, barely penetrating the wall of white. The sound came again, unmistakably, a cry, not human, but filled with a desperation that transcended species. Sarah hesitated, one hand on the curtain. Common sense warned against investigating strange noises during a blizzard in wolf country. Yet something about that keening cry tugged at a place inside her that had lain dormant since Thomas's passing. "Foolishness," she muttered, even as she reached for her heavy parka and the powerful flashlight from the emergency drawer. The thermometer outside her kitchen window read 15 degrees below zero, dangerous cold that killed within minutes of exposure. Sarah pulled on insulated pants over her flannel pajamas, wrapped a wool scarf around her neck, and tugged a knitted hat over her silver-streaked hair. The moment she cracked the door, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Snow blasted into the entryway as Sarah braced herself against the force of the storm. The beam of her flashlight barely penetrated 3 feet ahead, swallowed by the churning whiteness that had transformed her familiar property into an alien landscape. That cry came again, weaker now, but clearly emanating from beneath her woodshed, where a small space remained between the stacked logs and the frozen ground. Sarah fought her way across the porch, each step requiring deliberate effort against the wind's invisible push. The cold bit through her layers, stealing her breath as she carefully navigated the buried steps. "Hello," she called, the word instantly shredded by the gale. Sarah angled her flashlight toward the woodshed, its beam finally illuminating what had been calling through the storm. Two small forms huddled together in the narrow space, their grey fur dusted with snow, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam with an eerie blue-green glow. Wolf cubs, no more than a few months old judging by their size, though winter-thin, with ribs clearly visible beneath their coats. They shrank back as her light found them, pressing against each other with small whimpers that barely carried through the storm's roar. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every mountain resident knew the rules of survival in wolf country. Maintain distance, never feed, and above all, never interfere with cubs. Yet these young ones were alone in a killing storm, their mother nowhere in sight. No wolf would abandon her young willingly, especially not in weather that promised certain death for cubs this small. Time seemed suspended as Sarah stood in the whipping snow, her practical mind warring with the empathy that had always been both her strength and weakness. The smaller cub, its fur slightly darker around the ears, attempted to rise, only to collapse back into the snow with a cry that pierced Sarah's heart more effectively than the bitter cold. "Lord, help me," she whispered. Knowing what she was about to do contradicted everything she had learned about wildlife during her decades. In these mountains, the voice of Thomas seemed to whisper in her memory, "Sometimes mercy matters more than rules, Sarah." It had been his philosophy during 30 years as the town's only doctor, a belief that occasionally put him at odds with medical protocols but earned him the undying loyalty of everyone in Cedar Falls. Sarah made her choice. Some would call it foolish, others reckless. But as she slowly crouched down and extended her gloved hand toward the trembling cubs, she knew she could never live with herself if she retreated to her warm cabin, leaving them to a cold and lonely death. What she couldn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined on that frigid night, was how this decision would unfold into a sequence of events that would challenge her understanding of wild creatures and change not only her life, but the delicate balance of the entire Pinecrest Valley ecosystem. The wind seemed to intensify as Sarah inched closer to the woodshed, her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. The larger cub bared tiny teeth in warning, its instinctive wariness of humans still intact despite its desperate condition. The smaller one merely watched her approach, too weak for even token resistance. "It's all right," Sarah murmured, the soothing tone more important than the words themselves. "I'm not going to hurt you." With careful movements, she removed her scarf and laid it on the snow before her. The cubs watched with wary fascination as she slowly, inch by inch, extended the fabric toward them. The smaller cub sniffed cautiously at the wool, then pressed its nose against the warmth, a gesture so trusting it brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes, instantly freezing on her cheeks. The larger cub maintained its defensive posture until a powerful gust nearly toppled Sarah sideways. The sudden movement startled both animals, the larger one attempting a retreat deeper under the woodshed, only to find its path blocked by frozen debris. Its panicked yip seemed to decide something for the smaller cub, which took a trembling step onto Sarah's outstretched scarf. "That's it," Sarah encouraged, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Just a little more." Time slowed to heartbeats, measured in frozen breath as the smaller cub, then gradually its more reluctant sibling, allowed themselves to be gathered into the folds of Sarah's scarf. Their bodies felt like ice against her gloved hands, their weight alarmingly light as she cradled them against her chest and turned back toward the cabin. The journey that had taken 2 minutes outbound required nearly 10 to return, each step carefully placed to avoid falling with her precious cargo. By the time Sarah reached her door, the cubs had stopped struggling, their small bodies limp in a way that sent fear coursing through her. Inside, she kicked the door shut against the howling wind and carried the bundle directly to the fire. Years of caring for injured birds and orphaned fawns on her mountain property had taught Sarah the basics of wildlife rehabilitation. But wolves were different. Predators with specific needs and wild instincts that remained intact even in infancy. Still, the fundamental requirements remained the same: warmth, hydration, and safe containment. With focused urgency, Sarah laid the cubs on a thick towel near the hearth, maintaining enough distance to prevent overheating their chilled bodies. The smaller one barely moved as she gently dried its fur, but the larger cub watched her every movement with alert golden eyes. Using an old turkey baster from her kitchen drawer, Sarah carefully administered warm water mixed with a small amount of sugar for energy, relieved when both cubs accepted the liquid. Through the night, the blizzard, a battered Evergreen Lodge with unrelenting fury, but inside, a fragile trust was forming by firelight. Sarah dozed in her armchair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Waking every hour to check on her charges. By dawn, she had named them in her mind: Frost for the larger cub with ice-white paws, and Ember for the smaller one with russet-tinged ears that reminded her of glowing coals. Morning brought no relief. From the storm, the world outside her windows erased by a wall of swirling white, Sarah's first call on her satellite phone was to Maya Patel at the general store in Cedar Falls. "The roads are completely blocked," Maya reported, after expressing appropriate shock at Sarah's new house guests. "County says it'll be at least 3 days before they reach outlying properties. But I'll call Frank at the ranger station. He'll know what to do about those cubs." Sarah's second call, to Frank Erickson, yielded both concern and practical advice. "Keep them contained and minimize handling," the ranger instructed. "I'll contact Dr. Winters at Whispering Pines Wildlife Center. She's our wolf expert." "But Sarah," his voice grew serious, "you need to understand, these cubs can't be returned to the wild if they're with you more than a few days. And finding a placement isn't easy for wolves." "I understand," Sarah replied, though a growing attachment to the small creatures already pulled at her heart. "I'm just keeping them alive until you can reach me." But as the storm settled in, for what would become 9 days of isolation, Sarah's temporary rescue took on a more permanent character. The makeshift pen she constructed from plastic storage bins in her mudroom became a carefully regulated environment where the cubs gradually regained strength. Frost remained watchful and sometimes aggressive, while Ember developed an attachment to Sarah that both touched and troubled her. Each day brought new discoveries she carefully documented in Thomas's old medical journal. The cubs communicated, not just with vocalizations, but with a complex language of ear positions, tail movements, and facial expressions. They played fiercely with each other, but showed surprising gentleness when taking food from her hands. Most remarkably, they demonstrated problem-solving abilities that challenged Sarah's preconceptions about animal intelligence. On the 7th day, as Frost figured out how to open the latch on their enclosure using his nose and paws, Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. These weren't simply wild animals operating on instinct. They were individuals with distinct personalities and capabilities that blurred the lines between learned and innate behavior. When the snowplows finally carved a path to Evergreen Lodge on the 10th day, Dr. Rebecca Winters arrived in a 4-wheel drive truck emblazoned with the Whispering Pines Wildlife Center logo. The petite biologist with salt and pepper hair cropped close to her head brought an air of scientific authority that momentarily intimidated Sarah. making her question everything she'd done. "You've done remarkably well under the circumstances," Dr. Winters conceded after examining the cubs. "They're actually in better condition than I expected, but we have a difficult situation here." Over coffee at Sarah's kitchen table, the biologist explained the reality they faced. These cubs are too young to have survived this long without their mother, but old enough to have begun learning hunting behaviors. The window for successful reintroduction is narrowing by the day. "What about the wildlife center?" Sarah asked, her throat tightening at the thought of surrendering the cubs she had come to love. Dr. Winters sighed. "We're at capacity with 3 adult wolves already, and responsible sanctuaries rarely accept new wolves because they require such specialized care." She hesitated, studying Sarah with keen eyes. "There is another possibility, though it's highly unorthodox." The biologist's proposal startled Sarah. A controlled rehabilitation program right here at Evergreen Lodge, with Dr. Winters providing expertise and oversight through regular visits. The goal would be eventual release back into the wild, but with careful monitoring and gradual transition. "We've never attempted anything quite like this," Dr. Winters admitted. "But your property backs up against protected wilderness. You clearly have a connection with these cubs, and frankly, we're out of alternatives besides euthanasia, which I'm not prepared to recommend for healthy animals." That evening, after the biologist departed with promises to return in 3 days with proper equipment, Sarah sat beside the cub's enclosure, her mind swirling with doubt and determination. "What am I getting myself into?" she whispered as Ember pressed against her hand through the plastic barrier, the cub's golden eyes holding a trust that seemed impossible in a wild creature. What began as a desperate rescue during a blizzard transformed over the following weeks into a carefully structured rehabilitation program. Under Dr. Winters' guidance, Sarah converted her rarely used barn into a spacious enclosure with features that mimicked the cub's natural environment. A schedule was established that gradually reduced human contact while introducing challenges that would develop the skills the young wolves would need for survival. Through late winter and into spring's first tentative appearance, Sarah documented everything in the journal that now bulged with observations, questions, and moments of breakthrough. Dr. Winters initially visited every few days, then weekly as the cubs' progress exceeded expectations. Frank from the ranger station stopped by occasionally, his initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism about their unorthodox approach. "They're retaining their wild instincts," Dr. Winters noted with satisfaction as they observed the cubs successfully hunting the live rabbits reluctantly provided by Henry Dawson's farm. But they're also showing adaptability and problem-solving that might actually give them an advantage when released. The wolves grew rapidly, their fuzzy cub appearance giving way to the leaner lines of adolescent predators. Frost developed into a confident young male with an imposing presence, while Ember, though smaller, displayed an intelligence that sometimes seemed to border on calculation. When Frost figured out how to manipulate the locking mechanism on their enclosure, it was Ember who figured out how to push the barn door open. But also Ember who led them both back before dawn, as if understanding the protection the arrangement offered. As spring painted Pinecrest Valley with new life, Sarah faced the reality that had been approaching since the night of the blizzard. "We need to begin the release process," Dr. Winters announced during her weekly visit. "They're nearly full-grown now, and the longer we wait, the harder the transition will be." The release strategy involved a series of incremental steps, longer supervised excursions, overnight trips that stretched to multiple days, and gradually increasing the territory the young wolves were encouraged to explore. Sarah's role would diminish with each phase, her scent and presence becoming less prominent in their lives. "The hardest part," Dr. Winters warned, "will be the final separation. You'll need to be prepared for them not to return one day. That will actually be our success," On a clear morning in late May, Sarah opened the enclosure for what she understood might be the final time. Both wolves had been gone for 3 days on their longest independent journey yet, returning leaner and wilder each time. Now they stood at the threshold, their golden eyes holding a new awareness as they looked between the forest and the woman who had saved them. "Go on," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "You know what to do now." Frost moved, first trotting confidently toward the tree line without looking back. Ember lingered, her gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that seemed to transcend the barrier between species. Then, with a soft whine that might have been farewell, she turned and followed her brother into the shadows of the forest. Sarah stood, watching long after they disappeared, the empty space before her filled with memories of small paws and golden eyes. "Be safe," she murmured to the silent trees. The journals continued through summer, though with less frequent entries now. Sarah documented possible sightings, unusual tracks near her property, and the occasional distant howl that might belong to her wolves. Dr. Winter's tracking collars provided some data, showing the young wolves remained within the protected wilderness area, apparently healthy and hunting successfully. "They've joined up with another solitary female wolf," the biologist reported during her final official visit in August. "That's actually the best outcome we could have hoped for. They're forming a new pack structure." Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant color as Sarah settled back into the rhythms of solitary life, her days once again measured by simple tasks and quiet moments. The wolves became a cherished memory, a secret chapter in her life that had opened and closed like the seasons themselves, until the first unusual incident. It began with Sarah's chicken coop, which had occasionally lost members to foxes and raccoons over the years. One morning in late October, she discovered the predator-proof latch neatly manipulated, but instead of a scene of slaughter, she found the chickens untouched and a freshly killed rabbit placed in the center of the enclosure. Coincidence, Sarah told herself, though her heart raced with another possibility. A week later, she woke to find 3 fish arranged on her porch steps, their bodies still damp from the creek. No human visitors had been to Evergreen Lodge in days, and the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away. The incidents multiplied as winter approached. Game trails mysteriously cleared of deadfall after storms. Deer carcasses found at the edge of her property with only small portions consumed, and strange protective behavior from creatures that should have feared her presence. Rabbits grazed peacefully near her garden while she worked, and birds seemed untroubled by her approach. "Something's happening in these woods," Sarah told Frank during his routine check-in visit. "The normal rules don't seem to apply anymore." The ranger listened to her observations with growing interest. "There have been reports from hikers about unusual wolf behavior in the national forest. Wolves appearing on trails, but not showing. Aggression, even seeming to guide lost hikers back to marked paths." Sarah's journal filled with new entries, documenting patterns that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. Dr. Winters returned after hearing Frank's reports, bringing sophisticated camera equipment that they placed strategically around the property. The footage they captured left them speechless. Frost and Ember, now magnificent adult wolves, patrolling the perimeter of Sarah's property like sentinels. More incredibly, they appeared to be training younger wolves in what could only be described as deliberate behaviors, bringing food to specific locations, marking safe paths with scent, and even intervening when predators approached too near. The cabin. "This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Winters whispered as they reviewed the footage. "Wolves are intelligent, certainly, but this level of deliberate behavior toward a human dwelling suggests something beyond ordinary cognition." Winter returned to Pinecrest Valley, though milder than the historic blizzard that had brought the cubs into Sarah's life. On the anniversary of that night, as snow fell gently outside her window, Sarah sat in her rocking chair by the fire, reading through the journals that now filled an entire shelf, a chronicle of transformation that spanned not just the wolves' development, but her own renewal after Thomas's death. A sound outside drew her attention, not the wind this time, but a familiar whine she hadn't heard in months. Heart pounding, Sarah moved to the window and peered into the twilight. There, at the edge of her clearing, stood Frost and Ember, their magnificent forms unmistakable against the snow. But they weren't alone. Between them, 3 small cubs tumbled in the fresh powder, their play resembling the game Sarah had once watched in her barn. As she stood transfixed, Ember raised her head and looked directly at the window where Sarah stood, their eyes meeting across the distance. Then, with deliberate movement, the female wolf shepherded her cubs toward the cabin. Step by step, she led them to the very spot where Sarah had once gathered 2 freezing cubs into her scarf. Understanding dawned like sunrise. Ember had brought her offspring to meet the human who had changed the course of her life, a gesture that transcended natural explanation and spoke to something deeper about the bonds formed through compassion. Sarah waited quietly at her door, watching as Ember kept her distance, but clearly encouraged her curious cubs to investigate the cabin's scent. It was an introduction, Sarah realized, not an attempt to surrender her young, but a conscious sharing of worlds between species. The news spread beyond Pinecrest Valley in the months that followed. Wildlife researchers arrived to document what became known as the Mitchell effect, how one woman's act of mercy during a blizzard had created ripple effects throughout the ecosystem. The wolf pack that Frost and Ember established became renowned for unprecedented behaviors, creating safe corridors for smaller animals, forming unusual alliances with other predator species, and most remarkably, maintaining a protective perimeter around human structures while never threatening human safety. University studies documented how this single pack had changed predator-prey relationships across the entire valley, creating a more balanced ecosystem that benefited all species. The rangers reported fewer conflicts between wildlife and humans, as if the wolves were acting as mediators between worlds that had long been in opposition. On crisp evenings, Sarah still sits on her porch, watching the tree line for glimpses of her wolves. They never approach closely anymore, maintaining the necessary separation between wild and tame. But sometimes, when the light fades and shadows lengthen, Ember will appear briefly at the forest edge, her golden eyes finding Sarah across the distance, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that changed everything. Sarah's journals, meticulously maintained through seasons of discovery, now form the foundation of a groundbreaking study on animal cognition and cross-species communication. Dr. Winters visits regularly, bringing new researchers and technologies to document what she calls cognitive evolution in action. What you did, the biologist told Sarah recently, wasn't just about saving 2 cubs. You showed them a different possibility, that humans could be something other than threats, and they've built that understanding into how they interact with the world. As another winter approaches, Sarah Mitchell stands at her window, watching the first snowflakes drift from a darkening sky. At 60, she finds herself at the center of something extraordinary that began with a simple choice on a stormy night. The wolves have transformed her understanding of the natural world, challenging the boundaries she once accepted between human consciousness and animal awareness. The distant howl that rises from the forest carries a familiar cadence that brings a smile to Sarah's face. It reminds her of what Thomas always said about the choices that matter most, that compassion, once given freely, creates ripples we can never fully comprehend. As this story of Sarah and the wolves touched your heart, the remarkable journey shows us how a single act of kindness can transform not just one life, but an entire ecosystem. Remember that in our own lives, the most meaningful connections often begin in moments of compassion, when we choose to extend ourselves despite uncertainty. Subscribe now for more extraordinary stories that illuminate the profound bonds possible between humans and wildlife, and the unexpected ways nature responds to kindness. The morning after rescuing the cubs brought new challenges Sarah hadn't anticipated. The storm continued its assault on Evergreen Lodge, the wind howling through, the eaves like a living creature seeking entry. Through the frosted windows, she could see nothing but white, the world beyond her cabin erased by the blizzard's fury. The thermometer had dropped another 5 degrees overnight, confirming what the weather service had been warning. This was no ordinary winter storm, but a polar system that had dipped unusually far south, bringing Arctic conditions to mountains accustomed to merely severe winters. Inside, the young wolves had survived their first night, though the smaller one, Ember, still worried Sarah with her labored breathing and minimal movement. Frost showed more vitality, having lapped eagerly at the mixture of warm water and the venison broth Sarah had carefully heated on her wood stove. His golden eyes tracked her movements across the kitchen with a wariness that seemed beyond his young age. A reminder that even at a few months old, he carried the instincts of a wild predator. "You're quite the observer, aren't you?" Sarah murmured as she prepared more broth, adding a small amount of the dog food she kept for strays that occasionally wandered onto her property. Thomas had always teased her about her tendency to accumulate supplies for animals she didn't own. Birdseed, salt licks, specialized feeds, but now she felt vindicated by her preparedness. The memory of Thomas brought both comfort and a fresh wave of grief. What would he have said about her impulsive rescue? As a doctor, he had believed fiercely in preserving life, often going to extraordinary lengths for his patients in Cedar Falls. But he had also respected natural cycles, understanding that death was as much a part of the mountain ecosystem as life. "We can't save everything, Sari," he had told her once, after she'd spent weeks nursing an injured hawk that ultimately died. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Sarah arranged a more permanent space for the cubs in her mudroom, using storage bins lined with old blankets and towels. She placed them far enough apart that they wouldn't overheat, but close enough that the cubs could sense each other's presence. Ember remained worryingly lethargic, accepting liquid from the turkey baster, but making no attempt to move independently. Frost, meanwhile, had begun testing the boundaries of his container, his tiny claws scratching against the plastic sides. "You're not going anywhere just yet," Sarah told him firmly as she checked his makeshift bed for the 3rd time that morning. "Not until this storm passes and we figure out what happened to your mother." The question of the cubs' mother troubled Sarah deeply. Wolf packs in the Northridge Mountains were known to be fiercely protective of their young. For these cubs, to be alone, separated from their pack during a blizzard, suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Predator control programs had been controversial in the region for decades, with ranchers advocating for culling and conservationists fighting for protection. Sarah had always stayed neutral in these debates, understanding both sides while privately, hoping the wolves would be allowed to fulfill their natural role in the ecosystem. By midday, Sarah had established a careful routine, checking the cubs hourly while minimizing direct contact. She kept her satellite phone charged, knowing that, as soon as the storm allowed, she would need to contact the proper authorities. Frank Erickson at the ranger station was a reasonable man who understood the realities of mountain life, but even he would be concerned about a civilian harboring wolf cubs. Wildlife rehabilitation required permits, specialized knowledge, and facilities Sarah didn't possess. The second night proved even more challenging than the first. As darkness fell, Ember's condition deteriorated, her breathing shallow, her small body trembling despite the warmth of the cabin. Sarah sat beside the container, speaking softly to the struggling cub while consulting Thomas's old medical reference books. They contained little veterinary information, but the basics of treating hypothermia and shock remained similar across species. "Come on, little one," Sarah whispered as she carefully wrapped Ember in a heating pad set to low, monitoring her temperature with Thomas's old thermometer. "You've made it this far. Don't give up now." Outside, the wind changed direction, driving snow against the north side of the cabin with renewed violence. The electricity flickered once, twice, then failed completely, plunging the cabin into darkness relieved only by the orange glow of the wood stove. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, lighting oil lamps and checking the generator in the shed, attached to the mudroom. The ancient machine sputtered reluctantly to life, providing just enough power for essential systems, the freezer, minimal lighting, and most importantly, the heating pad that now seemed to be Ember's lifeline. Through the long night, Sarah dozed fitfully in the chair beside the cub's enclosure, waking hourly to check on their condition. Somewhere in the early morning hours, as the wind finally began to subside, she felt a small, rough tongue against her finger as she checked on Ember. The sensation jolted her fully awake. The smaller cub had raised her head, her golden eyes reflecting the lamplight as she tentatively licked at the broth on Sarah's fingertips. "Well, hello there," Sarah breathed, relief flooding through her tired body. "Decided to stay with us. After all, have you?" The moment felt sacred somehow, a small miracle in the aftermath of the storm's violence. Sarah knew enough about wildlife rehabilitation to recognize the danger in such moments. The temptation to anthropomorphize, to project human emotions onto wild creatures, to mistake biological imperatives for affection. Yet something in Ember's gaze seemed to transcend these scientific cautions, creating a connection that felt startlingly mutual. Dawn broke clear and blindingly bright, the storm having moved eastward overnight. The world outside Sarah's windows had been transformed. Familiar landmarks buried under 4 feet of pristine snow, trees bowed under white burdens, the landscape simplified to essential shapes and shadows. The temperature had risen marginally, enough that Sarah could venture onto her porch to assess the damage to her property. The woodshed had partially collapsed under the snow's weight, and somewhere beneath the white expanse was her garden shed and the old pickup truck she used for trips to town. The satellite dish on her roof appeared intact, but the antenna for her radio hung at an angle that didn't bode well for reception. Most concerning was the depth of snow blocking her long driveway to the county road, even if the plows made it. Out this far, it would be days before anyone could reach Evergreen Lodge. Inside, Sarah found both cubs alert and responsive for the first time since their rescue. Frost had managed to shred part of the towel in his enclosure, arranging the pieces into a nest-like structure in the corner. Ember remained weaker, but showed interest in her surroundings, her eyes following Sarah's movements with growing curiosity rather than fear. "You two are looking better," Sarah observed as she prepared their morning meal, the broth now enhanced with small pieces of softened meat. She had reviewed every scrap of information in her cabin related to canid care, drawing, primarily from books about dogs, but adapting based on her limited knowledge of wild wolves. The diet was her greatest concern. Wolf cubs would normally be transitioning from milk to regurgitated meat, provided by adult pack members, a process impossible to replicate exactly. The satellite phone connected on the third attempt, the signal weak but sufficient for a brief conversation with Maya at the general store. The news was sobering. Cedar Falls was effectively cut off from neighboring communities. Power lines were down throughout the county, and emergency services were overwhelmed. with calls from isolated homesteads and stranded motorists. "They're saying it's the worst blizzard since 1952, Maya reported, her usually cheerful voice strained. "The main road won't be cleared for at least 4 days, and they're not even talking about the side roads yet." "Are you okay up there, Sarah? Do you have enough supplies?" "I'm fine," Sarah assured her, deciding against mentioning the cubs until she could speak with Frank. "The generator's working, and I've got enough food for weeks. Tell everyone I'm safe, and to focus on those who need help more urgently." Her second call, to the ranger station, went unanswered. The recorded message explained that rangers were assisting with emergency operations and provided a number for true wilderness emergencies. Sarah hesitated, her finger hovering over the keypad. Did 2 orphaned wolf cubs constitute an emergency? They weren't in immediate danger now, and diverting resources from human rescue operations seemed unjustifiable. "Looks like it's just us. For a while longer," she told the cubs as she added more wood to the stove. "Let's make the best of it, shall we?" The forced isolation created an intensified reality within the walls of Evergreen Lodge. Sarah's world narrowed to the immediate needs of survival and the increasingly complex care of the young wolves. She established a schedule that provided structure to days that might otherwise have blurred together. Morning feeding and health checks, generator maintenance, snow clearing near essential access points, afternoon feeding and brief supervised exploration of the mudroom for the cubs, evening meal preparation and final health assessments. By the 4th day, both cubs had gained strength and become more active. Sarah had modified their enclosure to give them more space, using plastic storage bins connected by sections of old drainage pipe that allowed them to move between separate areas for feeding, elimination, and rest. Frost had grown bolder, testing the boundaries with increasing determination, while Ember had developed a habit of watching Sarah intently, her head tilted in what seemed remarkably like curiosity. "You're supposed to be afraid of me," Sarah informed her as she changed the bedding on the 5th morning, keeping her movements efficient and impersonal as the wildlife books recommended. "I'm doing my best not to habituate you to humans, you know." Ember responded by attempting to follow Sarah's hand as she withdrew from the enclosure, a behavior that both charmed and concerned her. Imprinting, the process by which young animals formed attachments to their caregivers, was a serious risk in wildlife rehabilitation. Cubs that identified too strongly with humans could never be safely returned to the wild, their natural instincts corrupted by misplaced trust in the most dangerous predator in their environment. The satellite phone rang just after noon on the 6th day, startling Sarah as she sorted through the dwindling supply of fresh vegetables in her refrigerator. Frank Erickson's voice came through clearly, professional but with an underlying warmth that reflected their years as neighbors in this remote corner of the mountains. "Maya said you were snowed in, but managing," the ranger began without preamble. "Anything you need to tell me that you didn't share with the general store gossip network?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I have 2 wolf cubs in my mudroom." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Sarah checked to make sure the connection hadn't failed. Finally, Frank spoke, his tone carefully neutral. "You want to explain how that happened, Sarah?" She recounted the night of the rescue, detailing the cub's condition and her subsequent care procedures. Frank listened without interruption, a courtesy that Sarah appreciated even as she braced for the reprimand that would surely follow. "You know I should be reading you the riot act right now," he said when she finished. "Interfering with wildlife, especially endangered apex predators, violates about 6 different federal and state regulations." "I know," Sarah acknowledged, "but they would have died, Frank. There was no mother, no pack, just 2 freezing cubs in a killing storm." Another lengthy pause followed, The female is still weak, you said? Yes, though she's improving, smaller than her brother and slower to recover. I've been keeping records of their food intake and body temperature, if that helps. It might. Frank conceded. Look, I can't get to you for at least another 3 days. The county's plowing the main access road to your area tomorrow, but even our service vehicles can't handle the drifts on the forest roads yet. Can you continue what you're doing until I can bring Dr. Winters out to assess them? Relief flooded through Sarah. Rebecca Winters from the Wildlife Center? Yes, of course I can manage until then. Good. Document everything. What they eat, how they behave, any changes you notice. And Sarah, minimize contact as much as possible. The last thing we need is socialized wolves being released back into the ecosystem. After hanging up, Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, a complex mix of emotions washing through her. Official involvement brought both reassurance and a reminder that her time with the cubs was temporary, as it should be. Yet already she felt a connection to these small creatures that had appeared so mysteriously in her life, particularly to Ember with her thoughtful gaze and delicate movements. This was always the plan, she reminded herself firmly. Get them healthy, get them to experts, get them back to the wild where they belong. The next 3 days passed in a blur of increasing activity as the cubs gained strength and required more complex care. Sarah moved them from the mudroom to the larger space of her rarely used guest bedroom, arranging furniture to create a secure enclosure while giving them more freedom to move. She introduced simple enrichment activities based on her reading, hiding, small pieces of meat in folded towels, varying feeding locations, and providing safe objects for them to investigate and chew. Watching them interact with these challenges proved fascinating. Frost approached problems with direct determination, using strength and persistence, while Ember demonstrated surprising problem-solving skills, observing first and then executing precise movements to achieve her goals. Their distinct personalities emerged more clearly with each passing day. Frost, independent and sometimes aggressive. Ember, thoughtful and increasingly interactive with Sarah, despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance. On the morning, Frank was scheduled to arrive with Dr. Winters. Sarah found herself lingering over the cub's morning health check, her hands gentle as she examined each one for signs of continued improvement. Frost tolerated her touch with typical wariness, but Ember pressed against her palm, that same golden gaze fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You're going to have a better life," she told the cub, softly. "Real wolves doing real wolf things, not stuck in a human house playing by human rules." The sound of an engine laboring up her long driveway ended the moment. Sarah straightened, assuming the professional demeanor she had practiced for this meeting. Frank's Forest Service truck appeared around the final bend, followed by an unfamiliar vehicle with the Whispering Pines Wildlife Center logo on its door. Sarah watched through the window as two figures emerged. Frank's tall, rangy form easily recognizable in his green uniform, and beside him a compact woman with short salt and pepper hair, wearing practical winter gear and carrying what looked like medical equipment. Taking a deep breath, Sarah went to meet them at the door. "You must be Sarah Mitchell," the woman said, extending a gloved hand. "Rebecca Winters. Frank tells me you've been playing Wolf Mother during the blizzard." Something in Dr. Winters' tone, a blend of scientific detachment and gentle humor, immediately put Sarah at ease. "Not by design," she replied, shaking the offered hand. "More by desperation and luck. Please come in and meet them." Leading the visitors to the guest bedroom, Sarah was suddenly self-conscious about her amateur arrangements. Would they seem inadequate to a professional? Had she unknowingly made critical mistakes in the cub's care? The questions must have shown on her face, because Dr. Winters gave her a reassuring smile as they paused outside the door. Frank says you've been meticulously documenting everything. That already puts you ahead of many emergency wildlife situations. Let's see what we're working with. The cubs reacted to the strangers predictably, Frost retreating to the farthest corner of the enclosure, a low growl rumbling in his throat, while Ember moved behind a chair, watching cautiously but without Frost's obvious aggression. Dr. Winters observed them without approaching, her experienced gaze taking in details Sarah hadn't even considered. Male and female, approximately 4 months old, based on dentition and size, she commented, making notes on a small tablet. The male shows appropriate wariness, good muscle tone. The female is underweight but alert, tracking movement correctly. She glanced at Sarah. May I see your records? For the next hour, Dr. Winters reviewed Sarah's makeshift journal, occasionally asking questions about specific behaviors or feeding responses. Frank inspected the enclosure, making small adjustments to strengthen weak points where growing cubs might eventually test the boundaries. Neither professional offered immediate criticism, which Sarah took as a positive sign. Finally, Dr. Winters closed the journal and turned to face Sarah directly. You've done remarkably well under the circumstances. They're actually in better condition than I would have expected, given their state when you found them. Relief washed through Sarah, followed immediately by an unexpected pang at what would come next. The cubs being taken to proper facilities, away from the home that had sheltered them through the crisis. When will you move them to the wildlife center? She asked, working to keep her voice steady and practical. Dr. Winters exchanged a glance with Frank before responding. That's where we have a difficult situation. These cubs are young enough that rehabilitation is possible, but old enough that they've begun forming critical associations about their environment. Moving them repeatedly could compromise their eventual release potential. What does that mean? Sarah asked, confusion replacing her preemptive sense of loss. It means, Frank interjected, that the wildlife center is at capacity, with 3 adult wolves already, and Rebecca thinks moving them might do more harm than good at this point. Dr. Winters nodded. Wolves are highly sensitive to changes during development. They're at an age where stability matters, but so does appropriate introduction to natural behaviors and environments. She studied Sarah thoughtfully. Your property directly borders protected wilderness, correct? And you've already established a rapport with these cubs without excessive handling or socialization. Yes to both, Sarah confirmed, a new possibility dawning that seemed simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Are you suggesting a controlled rehabilitation program right here? Dr. Winters confirmed. With professional oversight, of course. I'd provide expertise and equipment, visit regularly to monitor progress, and we'd work toward a soft release into the adjacent wilderness when they're ready. Sarah's mind raced with implications. Is that even legal? I don't have permits or training, or you'd be operating as an extension of my facility under my permits, Dr. Winters explained. It's unusual but not unprecedented for exceptional cases. And frankly, we're out of alternatives besides euthanasia, which I'm not prepared to recommend for healthy animals showing appropriate development. The word euthanasia sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. Then yes, she said firmly, I'll do whatever is needed to give them their best chance. Frank looked relieved at her response. I told Rebecca you'd be on board. The department's willing to provide additional support, trail cameras, tracking collars when the time comes, regular patrols of the release area to monitor for conflicts with hikers or hunters. We'll need to make significant changes, Dr. Winters cautioned, gesturing toward the makeshift enclosure. They'll need a proper outdoor space soon, with features that mimic their natural environment. And your interaction protocols will become more structured as we transition them toward independence. The conversation that followed outlined a rehabilitation plan more complex and demanding than Sarah had imagined possible. Dr. Winters sketched designs for a large enclosure that would utilize part of Sarah's barn and the adjacent wooded area, creating a space where the cubs could develop hunting skills, weather tolerance, and appropriate wariness of humans. The goal is methodical distancing, the biologist explained as she added details to the drawing. Right now, they associate humans, specifically you, with food and safety. We need to gradually shift those associations back to their natural environment while maintaining their health and development. By the time Frank and Dr. Winters prepared to leave, late afternoon shadows stretched across the snow-covered yard, and Sarah's mind was swimming with new terminology, schedules, and responsibilities. The wildlife veterinarian had examined both cubs thoroughly, administered vaccines, and taken blood samples for analysis back at her facility. "I'll return in 3 days with equipment and materials for the enclosure," Dr. Winters promised as she packed her medical bag. "In the meantime, continue what you've been doing, but start reducing direct interactions during feeding. Use a partition, if possible, so they don't see the food coming directly from your hands." After the visitors departed, their vehicles leaving deep tracks in the partially cleared driveway, Sarah returned to the guest bedroom where the cubs had retreated to, their sleeping area, clearly exhausted by the unfamiliar human presence. She sat quietly on the floor, a few feet from their enclosure, absorbing the enormity of what she had agreed to undertake. "Just until spring," she told herself softly, "just until they're strong enough to live as they were meant to live." But as Ember stirred, raising her head to gaze at Sarah with those intelligent golden eyes, a deeper truth settled in her heart. These creatures had already changed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, awakening, nurturing instincts, dormant, since her children had grown and left, reconnecting her to the natural world that had seemed so distant in her grief for Thomas, and providing purpose during the isolated winter months that had stretched emptily before her. This unexpected path would demand sacrifices of time, energy, and eventually emotional attachment. The wolves would leave her, as all wild things must. But for now, in the quiet twilight of a snowbound mountain evening, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to simply be present with the extraordinary circumstance that had entered her life, one tiny paw print at a time. Real work began the following week, transforming Sarah's ordinary mountain property into a specialized wildlife rehabilitation facility. Under Dr. Winters' guidance, the old barn became the foundation for a complex enclosure system designed to gradually transition the cubs from human care to self-sufficiency. Local rangers delivered materials, fencing, lumber, specialized feeding stations, and helped with the heavy construction during their off-duty hours. The Wildlife Center provided essential equipment on loan, and Henry Dawson contributed his carpentry skills to build elevated platforms that mimicked the natural ledges wolves might use in the wild. "Never thought I'd be building wolf furniture," the farmer remarked dryly as he secured the last support beam. "Marie would have my hide if she knew I was helping raise the very critters she thinks are after our livestock." "Maybe don't mention it at the next community meeting," Sarah suggested with a smile, passing him a thermos of coffee. Henry had been Thomas's closest friend, maintaining the connection even after Thomas's passing through regular check-ins and practical assistance. That never felt like charity. "Your secret's safe with me," he assured her, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Besides, these two are going to be released miles from my farm, if I understand the plan correctly." The completed enclosure was a masterpiece of practical design, incorporating both natural elements and necessary security features. A double-gate entry system prevented escapes during maintenance, while the interior space included varied terrain, a small artificial den, rock formations, fallen logs, and a recirculating water feature that wouldn't freeze in cold weather. One-way viewing panels allowed observation without the cubs seeing their watchers, an essential feature as Dr. Winters emphasized the importance of minimizing their association of food with human presence. "You've essentially created the Taj Mahal of wolf rehabilitation," Frank commented during his inspection of the finished structure. "Rebecca's already talking about using this as a model for future projects." The transfer of the cubs from the house to their new habitat marked the beginning of a new phase in their development. Dr. Winters supervised the process, ensuring minimum stress during the transition. Frost entered the enclosure warily, but with growing confidence as he discovered the complex environment, while Ember required gentle encouragement, clearly reluctant to leave the security of the arrangement she had come to trust. "That's normal," Dr. Winters assured Sarah, who watched anxiously from behind the viewing panel. "She's more attached to the familiar routine. But observe how quickly she's investigating once she feels secure. That's a good sign for her adaptability." The rehabilitation program followed a meticulously planned schedule that evolved as the cubs grew. Initial feeding occurred at regular intervals through a specialized chute that prevented them from seeing their human providers. Gradually, the schedule became less predictable, mimicking the irregular timing of meals in the wild. Live prey was introduced incrementally, first insects and small rodents, then larger animals like rabbits that required more complex hunting behaviors. Sarah documented everything in journals that grew to fill a dedicated shelf in her kitchen. Detailed observations of physical development, behavioral changes, social interactions between the siblings, and responses to environmental challenges. Dr. Winters reviewed these notes during her weekly visits, occasionally requesting specific observations or suggesting modifications to the habitat or feeding protocols. "You have a natural eye for behavioral nuance," the biologist commented one afternoon as they watched the cubs from the observation point. "These notes on their communication patterns are particularly valuable. We don't have much documentation of sibling interactions at this developmental stage." Winter mellowed into early spring, the snow receding gradually from the south-facing slopes of Pinecrest Valley. The cubs grew rapidly, their fuzzy juvenile coats giving way to the more defined coloration of adolescent wolves. Frost developed the broader head and powerful shoulders that would eventually mark him as an imposing adult male, while Ember remained more slightly built but demonstrated remarkable agility and problem-solving skills that consistently impressed the wildlife experts who occasionally accompanied Dr. Winters on her visits. The changes weren't limited to the wolves. Sarah found herself transformed by the experience as well. Her days now structured around their care, but in a way that felt purposeful rather than constraining. The deep grief that had enveloped her after Thomas's death hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making space for new experiences and connections. She found herself noticing details of the natural world that had previously blurred into the background. The specific calls of returning migratory birds, the subtle changes in vegetation as spring advanced up the mountainside, the intricate interdependence of species in the ecosystem surrounding her property. Thomas would be fascinated by all this, she told Dr. Winters during one of their observation sessions. He always said that healing didn't happen in isolation, that we're designed to connect, to be part of something larger than ourselves. The biologist nodded thoughtfully. He was right. It's true across species, really. Even predators like wolves exist within complex social and ecological networks. Independence is largely a human illusion. As spring painted Pinecrest Valley with wildflowers and fresh greenery, the rehabilitation program entered its most challenging phase, preparing the young wolves for potential release. Dr. Winters expanded their enclosure to include a larger section of wooded area adjacent to the barn. creating a transitional space where they could experience more natural hunting conditions while still within a controlled environment. "They're showing all the right indicators," she explained during the modification process. "Strong prey drive, appropriate wariness of unfamiliar humans, and healthy social bonding with each other. Now we need to see how they handle increased territory and more complex challenges." The expanded area included carefully designed features that would test the wolves' readiness for independence. Varied terrain that required navigation skills, hidden food sources that demanded tracking abilities, and even occasional recordings of other wolf packs played through weather-resistant speakers to gauge their response to potential territorial competitors. Sarah watched their progress with complicated emotions. Pride in their growing competence mingled with an awareness of approaching separation that sometimes caught her unawares, tightening her throat as she observed Ember's confident exploration of a new fallen log or Frost's increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques. "You're doing exactly what they need," Dr. Winters assured her, noticing Sarah's expression during a particularly impressive demonstration of Frost's stalking ability. The goal was always to prepare them for this transition. Their success is your success. By late April, the wolves had grown into lanky adolescents with all the awkward energy that stage entailed. Their play had taken on more serious overtones, resembling the practice hunting and fighting behaviors that would eventually ensure their survival. They still recognized Sarah's presence at the observation point, occasionally glancing toward her with what seemed like acknowledgement, but they no longer approached the human areas of the enclosure with the familiarity they had once shown. "It's time to begin the soft release process," Dr. Winters announced during her weekly visit after reviewing the latest health assessments and behavioral data. "They're physically ready, and keeping them confined much longer could create frustration, behaviors that might compromise their chances." The plan she outlined was incremental and cautious, a series of supervised excursions into the adjacent wilderness area, beginning with short periods and gradually extending to overnight adventures. Tracking collars would monitor their movements, allowing the team to evaluate their hunting success, territory establishment, and interactions with other wildlife. "And if they don't succeed?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had lingered beneath her determination throughout the rehabilitation process. "If they can't adapt to full independence?" Dr. Winter's expression was gentle, but realistic. "Then we reassess based on specific issues. But Sarah, from everything I've observed, these young wolves have remarkable potential. The resilience they've shown from the beginning suggests they have what it takes to thrive." The first release occurred on a perfect spring morning, the forest vibrant with new growth and the movement of creatures emerging from winter dormancy. Frank arrived with 2 additional rangers, both trained in wildlife management and armed with tranquilizer guns as a precaution. Dr. Winters fitted each wolf with a tracking collar, the devices barely visible beneath their thickening ruffs. "The collars are designed to expand with growth and eventually degrade and fall off," she explained as she made final adjustments to Ember's equipment. "They're as minimally invasive as current technology allows." Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing they had chosen for the release point, her heart pounding with an intensity that surprised her. After months of careful preparation, the moment felt simultaneously momentous and terrifyingly ordinary. Just another step in the natural progression that had begun that snowy night in February. Dr. Winters led the wolves to the forest boundary in specialized transport crates, setting them down carefully in the dappled shade beneath tall pines. "Ready?" she asked, glancing at Sarah and the rangers positioned strategically around the perimeter. At their nods, she opened the crate doors simultaneously and stepped back, allowing the wolves to emerge at their own pace. Frost exited immediately, his powerful body tense with alertness as he surveyed the unfamiliar territory. Ember hesitated, her nose working rapidly to process the wealth of new scents, before following her brother with more measured movements. For several minutes, the wolves remained near the crates, circling cautiously and taking in their surroundings. Then, Frost caught a scent that visibly captured his attention. His posture changed, head lowering and body tensing in the hunting stance they had observed so often during his training. Without a backward glance, he moved deeper into the forest, following whatever had triggered his predatory instinct. Ember lingered a moment longer, her golden gaze sweeping across the humans, watching from a distance. When her eyes met Sarah's, something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement, perhaps even a farewell. Then she too turned away, following her brother's path into the wilderness that was their birthright. 4 hours, Dr. Winters reminded the group as the wolves disappeared among the trees. We'll track them for 4 hours, then return them to the enclosure for this first excursion. The tracking technology allowed them to follow the wolves' journey at a distance that wouldn't interfere with their natural behaviors. Sarah watched the tablets display with fascination as the siblings covered remarkable territory, moving with purpose through the complex landscape. At one point, they apparently detected a deer, the GPS points showing the accelerated movement and circular tracking pattern characteristic of a hunt. They didn't catch it, Frank noted as they observed the data. But the approach was textbook, pack hunting behavior. They're working together instinctively. By the time the 4-hour limit approached, Sarah had gained new appreciation for the wolves' capabilities. They had traveled nearly 5 miles through difficult terrain, investigated multiple potential prey opportunities, and even appropriately avoided an area where hiking trails indicated human presence. Recapturing them proved surprisingly straightforward. Dr. Winters activated the special tone emitters attached to their collars, a sound the wolves had been conditioned to associate with food rewards during their training. Within 20 minutes, both had returned to the clearing, tired but visibly invigorated by their adventure. Successful first outing by any measure, Dr. Winters declared as they secured the wolves for transport back to the enclosure. They demonstrated appropriate exploration, hunting attempts, and even hazard avoidance. Most importantly, they stayed together and returned when signaled. Over the following weeks, the excursions increased in duration and complexity. Sometimes the wolves were released in different locations to test their adaptability and navigation skills. Sometimes small challenges were introduced, such as strategically placed scent markers from other predators or manufactured obstacles in their usual paths. Each time they demonstrated growing confidence and competence in the wild environment. After the 5th extended release, this one lasting a full 24 hours, Dr. Winters called a meeting with Sarah and the ranger team to discuss the next steps. They gathered around her kitchen table, reviewing data from the tracking collars and trail cameras that had been positioned throughout the release area. They're consistently succeeding at all our assessment metrics, the biologist began, pulling up images that showed the wolves successfully hunting a rabbit and defending their kill from opportunistic ravens. They're navigating efficiently, finding appropriate shelter, and showing all the natural behaviors we would expect from wild-born wolves of similar age. What about other wolves? Sarah asked, the question that had concerned her throughout the process. We know there are at least 2 established packs in the broader wilderness area. Frank nodded, taking over this portion of the briefing. We've documented scent marking by the Clearwater Pack about 8 miles north of our release sites. So far, Frost and Ember have remained within their own emerging territory and haven't challenged the boundaries. That's actually perfect behavior for young wolves establishing themselves. The transition to full independence should begin now, Dr. Winters announced as May brought warmer temperatures to Pinecrest Valley. The mountain slopes burst with wildflowers and fresh greenery, while birdsong filled the dawn hours with complex melodies. Their development is right on schedule, and delaying further could create dependency issues that might compromise their wild behavior. Sarah nodded, despite the tightness in her chest. She had known this moment would come since the beginning, had prepared for it mentally throughout the rehabilitation process, yet the reality of final separation struck harder than anticipated. Over the past months, she had watched Frost and Ember grow from vulnerable cubs into capable young wolves, their personalities and abilities unfolding like a remarkable story written in fur and golden eyes. "What exactly does the transition involve?" she asked, focusing on practical details to steady her emotions. Dr. Winters spread a topographical map across Sarah's kitchen table, pointing to specific features in the wilderness adjacent to the property. "We'll conduct a series of increasingly extended releases, monitoring them remotely rather than recalling them to the enclosure. They'll establish territory, practice hunting independently, and gradually adapt to life without human support. The tracking collars will let us observe from a distance, intervening only if absolutely necessary." Frank added additional markers to the map, indicating ranger stations and known territories of established wolf packs. "We've identified this area as optimal for their release," he explained, circling a section approximately 12 miles northeast of Sarah's cabin. "Good prey population, minimal human interference, and sufficient distance from existing packs to allow them time to establish themselves." The preparations for final release proceeded with scientific precision. The wolves underwent thorough health examinations to ensure they carried no parasites or diseases that might spread to wild populations. Their tracking collars were upgraded to more sophisticated models with extended battery life and improved satellite connectivity. Trail cameras were strategically placed throughout the target territory to supplement the tracking data with visual confirmation of behavior and physical condition. Through it all, Sarah maintained professional detachment during daylight hours, following protocols and assisting with preparations. But in the evening solitude of her cabin, she allowed herself to process the impending separation, leafing through the journals, documenting months of extraordinary connection. The pages chronicled not just the wolves' development, but her own transformation, from grief-shadowed widow to active participant in a wildlife conservation effort that had given her renewed purpose. "I'm not losing them," she reminded herself, tracing a finger over a sketch she had made of Ember's distinctive facial markings. "I'm fulfilling the promise I made the night I found them. This was always the goal." The final day arrived with perfect early summer weather. Clear skies, mild temperatures, and light winds ideal for tracking. Dr. Winters arrived before dawn with her assistant, a doctoral student specializing in wolf behavior who had visited several times during the rehabilitation process. Frank brought 2 additional rangers, all equipped with field gear for the extended monitoring period that would follow the release. "We'll maintain a 24-hour observation schedule for the first 3 days, Dr. Winters explained as they gathered in Sarah's kitchen for final preparations. "After that, we'll evaluate their progress and determine the appropriate level of ongoing monitoring." Sarah nodded, her attention divided between the briefing and the preparation of the specialized food packages that would be hidden throughout. The initial release area, small amounts of familiar food that would provide backup nourishment as the wolves transitioned to fully independent hunting. Each package contained a carefully calculated ratio of protein and fat designed to supplement without creating dependency. "Sarah will ride with me to the release point," Dr. Winters continued, acknowledging her essential role in the process. "The rest of you should proceed to your assigned monitoring stations. Remember, absolute minimum visibility to the subjects. We want their last human associations to fade as quickly as possible." The transport carriers were loaded into Dr. Winters' specially equipped vehicle, the wolves entering the familiar containers with none of the resistance they had shown in earlier stages. They had learned that these temporary confinements, led to new territories and hunting opportunities, their natural adaptability transforming what might have been a stressful experience into an anticipated adventure. The drive to the release point followed Forest Service roads for the first few miles, then transitioned to rugged tracks that tested the vehicle's four-wheel drive capability. Sarah sat silently in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at the carriers where Frost and Ember waited with remarkable patience. Having second. "Your thoughts?" Dr. Winters asked gently, navigating around a fallen branch that partially blocked the narrow trail. "Not about the release," Sarah clarified, turning back to face forward. "That's what they need. I just didn't expect to feel quite so invested," the biologist suggested. "It's normal, you know. We train wildlife rehabilitators to maintain professional boundaries. But complete detachment isn't realistic when you've nurtured a creature from near death to independence. The attachment you feel isn't inappropriate. It's actually a reflection of how seriously you've taken your responsibility to them." The conversation eased some of Sarah's tension, allowing her to appreciate the wild beauty surrounding them as they entered deeper wilderness. Ancient pines towered overhead, their needled branches filtering sunlight into dappled patterns across the forest floor. The undergrowth teemed with life. A snowshoe hare froze motionless as they passed, while a startled grouse exploded from cover in a thunder of wings. "Perfect habitat," Dr. Winters commented, clearly pleased with the conditions. "Rich with prey, natural shelter options, and minimal human impact. If they're going to succeed, this environment gives them every advantage." They reached the designated release point shortly before noon, a small clearing beside a meandering stream that provided immediate access to water. Sarah helped unload the carriers, positioning them at the forest edge where the wolves would have multiple escape routes available. Following established protocol, they set up the portable monitoring station at a distance that wouldn't interfere with the wolves' movements, then prepared for the critical moment of release. "Would you like to open the carriers?" Dr. Winters offered, surprising Sarah with the suggestion. "You found them, you saved them, you rehabilitated them. It seems fitting that you should be the one to complete the circle." Emotion welled in Sarah's throat as she approached the carriers one last time. She crouched between them, placing a hand on each without speaking. Then with deliberate movements, she unlatched both doors simultaneously and stepped back to join Dr. Winters at the monitoring station. Frost emerged first, as he had during their training releases, his powerful body tense with alertness as he surveyed the new territory. His coat gleamed healthy and thick in the dappled sunlight, the silver-gray coloration that had given him his name, now complemented by darker markings along his back and face. He had grown into a magnificent young wolf, his bearing confident but cautious, as he tested the air with raised nose and focused gaze. Ember followed moments later, her more delicate frame belying the strength and agility she had developed throughout. Rehabilitation. She paused at the carrier entrance, golden eyes scanning the environment with the thoughtful assessment that characterized her approach to new situations. Unlike Frost's straightforward survey, Ember's attention moved systematically across the clearing, noting details and potential points of interest with almost analytical precision. "Look at that evaluation behavior," Dr. Winters murmured, recording observations on her tablet without shifting her gaze from the wolves. Ember's environmental processing is extraordinarily sophisticated for her age. The siblings moved into the clearing together, maintaining the close proximity that had been consistent throughout their development. Their coordination required no visible signals, a subtle shift in Frost's weight, prompting corresponding adjustment from Ember, her pause at an interesting scent, automatically slowing her brother's pace. They had developed the silent communication essential to successful pack hunting, their movements synchronized by instinct and shared experience. For nearly 20 minutes, the wolves explored the immediate release area, investigating scents and sounds with increasing confidence. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they turned simultaneously toward the denser forest to the north. Frost led the way, setting a purposeful pace that Ember matched effortlessly. Without a backward glance toward the humans who had guided their development, they disappeared into the wilderness that was now their domain. "They're officially wild," Dr. Winters said softly, checking the tracking data that showed the wolves moving steadily through the forest in a pattern consistent with territorial exploration. "And they're doing exactly what they should be doing." Sarah watched the point where they had vanished, emotions conflicting beneath her composed exterior. Pride in their confident departure mingled with the inevitable sadness of separation, while beneath both ran a current of genuine optimism about their future. These weren't the desperate freezing cubs she had rescued during the blizzard, but capable predators reclaiming their rightful place in the ecosystem. "They'll be all right," she said, as much to herself as to her companion. "They're ready for this." The monitoring period that followed brought encouraging data. The wolves established a loosely defined territory centered around a ridge system, approximately 3 miles from the release point, with access to both the stream and several game trails used by deer and smaller prey. Trail cameras captured successful hunts, initially rabbit and squirrel, then eventually a yearling deer brought down through coordinated effort that impressed even the experienced wildlife biologists reviewing the footage. Sarah remained involved in the monitoring process, reviewing data and occasionally accompanying research teams during field observations, always maintaining the required distance to avoid influencing the wolves' behavior. Her kitchen became an informal headquarters where scientists and rangers gathered to discuss findings and plan ongoing conservation efforts. The journals documenting Frost and Ember's rehabilitation provided valuable reference material for a research paper Dr. Winters was preparing on wolf cognitive development and adaptive intelligence. June brought warmer weather and increased wildlife activity throughout Pinecrest Valley. The wolves expanded their territory, their movements becoming more confident as they established regular hunting patterns and explored the full range of their environment. Tracking data showed healthy activity levels and normal behavioral markers, validating every aspect of the rehabilitation program. "They've exceeded all our success metrics," Dr. Winters reported during their weekly review session. "Territory establishment, hunting efficacy, appropriate reaction to other predators. They're functioning exactly as we would expect naturally raised wolves to function." Yet amid the celebration of rehabilitation success, an unexpected development emerged. The tracking data revealed a consistent pattern. Every third or fourth night, the wolves made a long journey to a specific location approximately 1 mile from Sarah's cabin, lingering there for several hours before returning to their primary territory. This behavior had no clear ecological explanation, as the area contained no special resource or geographical feature that would attract regular visits. "It could be simple exploration," Frank suggested when the pattern was first identified. Young wolves often investigate widely before settling into stable territories. But as the behavior continued unchanged through weeks of monitoring, Dr. Winters grew increasingly curious. "This isn't random," she noted, reviewing the remarkably consistent GPS tracks. "They're deliberately visiting this specific location with unusual regularity." Sarah recognized the coordinates with a start. "That's the old lightning-struck pine near my north property line," she said, studying the map more closely. "It's where I often leave feed for deer during harsh winters. Thomas and I called it the giving tree because of how many animals it helped through difficult seasons." This connection prompted a careful investigation of the site. Frank and Dr. Winters installed additional cameras and conducted a thorough survey of the area, discovering something remarkable in the process. The wolves had established what appeared to be a food cache near the ancient pine, a collection of small prey items arranged with deliberate care in a sheltered depression beneath the tree's massive roots. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Winters admitted, reviewing the camera footage that showed Frost and Ember delivering fresh-caught rabbits to the cache on multiple occasions. Wolves sometimes cache excess food for later consumption, but this location is far from their primary territory, and they're not returning to feed from it. It's almost as if she hesitated, reluctant to suggest an interpretation that strayed into anthropomorphism, the attribution of human motivations to animal behavior that represented a cardinal sin in serious wildlife biology. "As if they're leaving it for something else," Sarah completed the thought, voicing what the scientist couldn't bring herself to suggest, or someone. The implications of this behavior sparked intense debate among the research team. Some suggested practical explanations. Perhaps the site had advantageous preservation properties for stored food, or represented a secondary feeding area the wolves were establishing for seasonal use. Others acknowledged the possibility of more complex motivations, pointing to documented cases of reciprocal relationships between different species in shared ecosystems. There's growing evidence that wolves have cognitive abilities we're only beginning to understand, Dr. Winters noted during one particularly heated discussion. Their social structures and communication systems are far more sophisticated than we recognized even a decade ago. I'm not suggesting we anthropomorphize, but we should remain open to behaviors that don't fit our existing models. Sarah listened to these scientific debates with interest, but found herself drawing more personal conclusions. The food cache appeared shortly after she had stopped visiting the observation points along the wolves' territory, a deliberate withdrawal meant to encourage their independence. Its location at a spot associated with her past feeding activities seemed meaningfully specific rather than coincidental. "They remember," she thought but didn't say aloud, knowing how such sentimental interpretation would be received by the research team. They're acknowledging the connection. By July, the scientific monitoring program had been scaled back to weekly data collection, with the tracking collars programmed to upload movement information at regular intervals rather than continuous transmission. The wolves had fully established themselves in their wilderness territory, demonstrating all the behaviors necessary for long-term survival. Dr. Winters had shifted her focus to analyzing the extensive data collected during the rehabilitation process, while Frank and his rangers returned to their normal duties, monitoring the broader wilderness area. Sarah found herself settling into a new routine as well, her days no longer dominated by wolf care responsibilities. She resumed long-neglected projects around the property, started volunteering at the community library in Cedar Falls 2 days a week, and began preliminary work on a children's book about wildlife conservation, inspired by her experience with Frost and Ember. Yet she maintained her own quiet monitoring of the lightning-struck pine, visiting every few days to observe the food cache from a respectful distance. The wolves continued their regular deliveries, though they never appeared during her visits. The cache itself evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated in construction. Branches and leaves arranged to protect the food items from weather, and opportunistic scavengers, with larger caches carefully positioned for optimal preservation. "I'm not interfering," Sarah assured Frank when he expressed mild concern about her continued interest. "I'm just observing. They're living their wild lives exactly as they should be, and I'm respecting that boundary completely." The ranger nodded, knowing her well enough to trust her judgment. "Just making sure you're finding your own way forward too. These transition periods can be challenging, for humans as much as wildlife." August brought the first significant change to the established pattern. The tracking data showed the wolves venturing into new territory approximately 15 miles north of their established range, an area known to overlap with the territory of the Clearwater Pack, one of the established wolf groups in the broader wilderness. This movement triggered cautious concern among the monitoring team, as territorial conflicts between wolf packs could result in serious injury or death, particularly for younger wolves challenging established boundaries. "Should we intervene?" Sarah asked during an emergency meeting called to address the situation. The thought of Frost and Ember facing a potentially deadly confrontation with a larger, experienced pack filled her with dread that transcended scientific detachment. Dr. Winters shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. This is a natural phase in wolf social development, testing boundaries, encountering other packs, establishing their place in the broader social landscape. Interference now would undermine everything we've worked toward." The tense waiting period that followed tested Sarah's commitment to the rehabilitation philosophy she had embraced throughout the process. For 3 days, the tracking data showed Frost and Ember remaining in the contested territory, their movements suggesting careful exploration rather than retreat. The research team monitored remotely, prepared to intervene only if tracking indicated severe injury or immediate life threat. On the 4th day, the situation resolved in an unexpected manner. Rather than conflict, the tracking patterns suggested interaction between the siblings and the established pack. Parallel movements, shared hunting grounds, and eventually convergence at what appeared to be a communal kill site. Trail cameras later confirmed what the data had indicated. Frost and Ember had been cautiously accepted by the Clearwater Pack, not as full members, but as tolerated associates allowed to share territory under specific conditions. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Winters explained during their review of the footage. Young wolves typically face significant aggression when approaching established packs. The Clearwater alpha pair appears to be allowing limited integration, possibly because Frost and Ember demonstrated appropriate submission behaviors, or perhaps because the pack benefits from additional hunting support without the full resource commitment of new pack members. This development represented an ideal outcome from a conservation perspective. Association with an established pack would provide the siblings with additional security and hunting efficiency, while exposure to fully wild wolves would reinforce natural behaviors that might have been subtly influenced by their early human contact. The research team celebrated this natural integration as the final validation of their rehabilitation approach. Yet even as the wolves expanded their social connections within the wild population, they maintained their mysterious connection to the lightning-struck pine. The food cache continued to receive regular contributions, though the pattern shifted to accommodate their wider-ranging territory and new pack associations. Sarah documented these visits with the same scientific rigor she had applied throughout the rehabilitation process, noting changes in frequency, timing, and the types of food items delivered. September painted the mountains with autumn colors, as cooler temperatures brought the first hint of the winter to come. Sarah found herself thinking often of the snowy night that had brought the cubs into her life, the seasonal shift triggering memories of their desperate condition and remarkable recovery. The journals documenting their journey had been formalized into proper research records, copies provided to both the Wildlife Center and the Forest Service as reference for future rehabilitation efforts. "Your documentation has been invaluable," Dr. Winters told her during what had become a monthly check-in visit. "The detail and consistency provide insights we rarely get in wildlife rehabilitation cases. I'm incorporating significant portions into the research paper with full credit to you as a contributor, of course." Sarah appreciated the professional recognition, but found greater satisfaction in the tangible outcomes of their work. 2 young wolves successfully integrated into the wild population, contributing to the genetic diversity and ecological balance of the Pinecrest Valley ecosystem. The tracking data continued to show healthy movement patterns and normal behavioral markers, with increasing integration into the broader wolf social structure of the region. As autumn deepened, a new pattern emerged in the wolves' behavior. The tracking data showed Frost remaining primarily with the Clearwater pack, while Ember began making more independent journeys, often returning to their original territory near the release site. This type of gender-based behavioral divergence was consistent with natural wolf development, young males typically maintaining closer pack associations, while females sometimes established more independent patterns ahead of potential mate-seeking behavior. She's likely preparing for the next stage of her life cycle, Dr. Winters explained when Sarah noted the change. Female wolves her age often begin exploring potential denning sites and establishing territories separate from their birth packs. It's completely normal development, especially with mating season approaching in the winter months. This natural progression represented yet another transition point in the wolves' journey toward fully independent wild lives. Sarah found herself both proud of their continuing adaptation and wistful about the increasing distance, both physical and metaphorical, between herself and the creatures she had nurtured through such vulnerable beginnings. The first snow fell in early October, a gentle dusting that melted by midday, but served as a reminder of the changing seasons. Sarah began her annual winterization routine, checking the generator, stacking additional firewood, and stocking the pantry with shelf-stable provisions that would sustain her through potential weather isolations. The memories of the previous winter's historic blizzard remained vivid, informing her preparations with hard-earned wisdom about mountain survival. On a crisp morning with frost silvering the meadow grasses, Sarah decided to make what she expected would be her final visit to the lightning-struck pine before winter weather made the trail impassable. The food cache had been less active in recent weeks, the wolves' changing patterns and integration with wild food sources naturally reducing their connection to this mysterious ritual. She brought her camera to document the site one last time, for the research records, along with a thermos of hot tea and Thomas's old journal, now her own, to record any final observations. The forest welcomed her with autumn stillness, the deciduous trees already bare, while evergreens maintained their steadfast green against the approaching winter. The trail to the ancient pine showed signs of recent wildlife activity. Deer tracks crossing the path, squirrel middens piled beneath productive trees, and the distinctive three-toed prints of wild turkeys foraging through fallen leaves. The lightning-struck pine stood as it had for decades, its massive trunk split near the top, where long ago lightning had shattered its crown but failed to kill the resilient tree. Its lower branches remained green and vital, creating a sheltered space beneath that had attracted wildlife long before Sarah and Thomas had designated it as a feeding station. She approached quietly, camera ready to document whatever remained of the food cache after weeks of decreased activity. What she found stopped her in her tracks, heart suddenly racing beneath her warm jacket. The cache had been completely reconstructed, not just maintained but architecturally transformed into a more sophisticated structure. Branches had been carefully arranged to create a sheltered alcove, lined with dried grasses and cedar boughs that provided both insulation and natural pest repellent properties. Within this protected space lay not the usual assortment of small prey, but a single deer leg, fresh killed and deliberately positioned at the center of the structure. More stunning than the cache itself were the tracks surrounding it, wolf prints in the soft earth, made within hours judging by their clarity and definition. They showed a deliberate pattern of movement around the site, Not the efficient approach and departure of a simple food delivery, but a complex circuit that suggested inspection, adjustment, and purposeful arrangement. Sarah's scientific training warred with the emotional response rising within her. This level of deliberate construction went beyond the food storage behaviors documented in wild wolves, suggesting a degree of planning and abstract thought that challenged conventional understanding of canid cognition, yet attributing human-like intention to wild animal behavior represented the kind of anthropomorphism that undermined serious wildlife science. As she struggled with these conflicting perspectives, a sound from the forest edge captured her attention, not threatening, but deliberately made. She turned slowly, already knowing what she would find, but unprepared for the impact of the moment. Ember stood approximately 30 yards away, her stance relaxed but attentive, golden eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable recognition. She had grown into her full adult form, her coat thick and healthy in preparation for winter, her bearing showing the confidence of a wolf who had successfully claimed her place in the wilderness. No longer the vulnerable cub rescued during a blizzard, she now embodied the wild strength and intelligence that had always been her birthright. Time seemed suspended as they regarded each other across the clearing. Woman and wolf, connected by a shared journey neither could have anticipated. Sarah remained motionless, allowing Ember to control the interaction, acutely aware of the extraordinary nature of this encounter. Wild wolves typically avoided human contact completely, their natural wariness reinforced by centuries of conflict. Yet here stood Ember, deliberately revealing herself to the human who had once saved her life. For several heartbeats, neither moved. Then Ember lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in what appeared to be acknowledgement. She turned with fluid grace, pausing once to look back at Sarah before disappearing into the forest shadows. Her movement so silent and efficient that she seemed to melt into the landscape rather than pass through it. Sarah remained rooted to the spot, the encounter imprinted on her consciousness with crystalline clarity. The scientific part of her mind automatically documented details, time, distance, behavioral markers, while her emotional response flooded her with a complex mix of joy, pride, and bittersweet recognition of completed circles. Ember had not approached closely or sought physical contact, maintaining the appropriate boundary between wild predator and human observer. Yet she had deliberately revealed herself, acknowledging the connection that transcended their different worlds. When Sarah finally gathered herself enough to continue her documentation, she noticed something she had missed in the initial shock of the encounter. Near the reconstructed cache lay a small, distinctive object, partially covered by leaves, a polished river stone with a natural hole through its center. She recognized it immediately as one of the enrichment items they had placed in the rehabilitation enclosure months ago, a natural toy that Ember had shown particular interest in carrying it between different areas of the habitat and manipulating it with remarkable dexterity. Sarah carefully photographed the stone in place without touching it, her scientific training maintaining proper protocol despite the emotional significance of the discovery. The presence of this specific object transformed the already extraordinary cache site into something that defied simple explanation, a deliberate transfer of an item from human care to wild context, placed at a location that connected both worlds. The journey back to her cabin passed in a daze of processing, Sarah's mind working through the implications of what she had witnessed. By the time she reached Evergreen Lodge, practical decisions had formed from emotional response. She would document everything with scientific precision, provide the data to Dr. Winters and the research team, but hold her own interpretations with appropriate humility. The wolf's behavior existed on its own terms, neither diminished by clinical reduction, nor elevated by human sentimentality. That evening, As darkness settled over the mountains and the first serious snowfall of the season began, Sarah completed her journal entry with measured words that acknowledged both the observable facts and the deeper mysteries they contained. She described Ember's appearance, the reconstructed cache, and the river stone with meticulous attention to detail, creating a record that would stand up to scientific scrutiny while honoring the significance of the encounter. In the coming days, she would share this documentation with the research team, contributing to the expanding understanding of wolf cognition and behavior. Dr. Winters would incorporate the observations into her ongoing study, perhaps noting the unusual nature of the cache construction and direct encounter, while maintaining appropriate scientific caution about interpretation. Frank and the Forest Service would update their wildlife management protocols based on the successful rehabilitation outcomes, potentially expanding similar programs for other displaced predators. Yet beyond these practical applications lay something more personal and profound. Sarah Mitchell had entered this unexpected journey as a grieving widow seeking to save two dying cubs from a winter storm. She emerged with renewed purpose, deeper connection to the natural world, and a transformed understanding of the intelligence and adaptability that existed beyond human experience. As snow accumulated outside her windows, Sarah added a final note to her journal entry. What happened here transcends simple categories of wild and tame, human and animal. Frost and Ember have reclaimed their rightful place in the wilderness, yet they've carried something with them from their time in human care. Not dependence or domestication, but perhaps a broader understanding of coexistence. And in return, they've given me something equally valuable. A reminder that compassion creates connections that endure even as circumstances change. These wolves belong to the wilderness now, their future unfolding according to nature's design rather than human intervention. Yet the bridge built between our worlds remains invisible but undeniable, a testament to what becomes possible when boundaries are crossed with respect and mutual adaptation. The mountain winter settled in earnest over the following weeks. Deep snow transforming Pinecrest Valley into a postcard landscape of pristine white, broken only by evergreen sentinels and rocky outcroppings, too steep for snow to cling to. Sarah maintained her connection to the research effort through regular communications with Dr. Winters, reviewing tracking data that showed both wolves continuing to thrive despite the seasonal challenges. Frost had fully integrated with the Clearwater Pack, his tracking data showing participation in coordinated hunts and territorial patrols consistent with accepted pack behavior. Ember maintained more independence, establishing a distinct territory that overlapped occasionally with her brother's range, but remained functionally separate. A pattern typical of female wolves preparing for potential pair bonding and reproduction. In the coming breeding season, the mystery of the lightning-struck pine and its elaborate cache eventually became incorporated into the formal research documentation, categorized as novel resource management behavior meriting further study. Trail cameras installed after Sarah's encounter captured occasional visits from Ember, who continued to maintain the structure with apparent deliberation, though no further direct human encounters occurred. Scientific papers were eventually published, wildlife management protocols updated, and conservation strategies adjusted based on the successful rehabilitation outcomes. Yet beyond these tangible results lived something less quantifiable but equally significant, a story of connection that crossed conventional boundaries, demonstrating the complex interdependence of all living things within a shared ecosystem. For Sarah Mitchell, the journey that began on a desperate winter night continued through changing seasons and circumstances, each day offering new opportunities to honor the lessons learned from two wolf cubs who had transformed not just her understanding of wildlife, but her perception of her own place within the natural world. Her cabin remained a gathering point for researchers, conservationists, and local residents interested in positive human-wildlife coexistence, while her emerging children's books about responsible conservation reached audiences far beyond Pinecrest Valley. And occasionally, on particularly clear winter nights when the moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape to near daylight brightness, Sarah would stand on her porch and listen to the distant chorus of wolf howls echoing across the valley. The voices of the Clearwater Pack claiming their territory and affirming their bonds. Among those wild voices, she sometimes thought she could distinguish two particular tones, one deep and confident, the other slightly higher with a distinctive melodic quality, the voices of wolves who had once sheltered beneath her roof and now carried that brief connection into the wider wilderness that was their true home. The second winter since the wolves' release brought record snowfall to Pinecrest Valley. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as another layer of white descended, transforming the landscape into a pristine canvas broken only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees bending under their heavy burdens. The forecast warned of temperatures dropping well below zero, conditions reminiscent of the blizzard that had brought frost and ember into her life 2 years earlier. "Full circle," she murmured, adding another log to the wood stove that radiated. Welcome heat throughout the cabin. The generator hummed steadily in its shed, a precaution against the power outages that frequently accompanied severe mountain storms. Sarah had prepared for this winter with the thoroughness born of experience, the pantry stocked with provisions, emergency supplies refreshed, communication systems backed up with redundancies that would maintain her connection to the outside world, regardless of weather conditions. Much had changed in the 20 months since the wolves' final release. Dr. Winters had published her research paper, Cognitive Development and Territorial Adaptation in Rehabilitated Grey Wolves, featuring Sarah as a contributing author. The SAG documentation of their rehabilitation process had been adopted as a model by wildlife centers across 3 states, while Frank had been promoted to head ranger based partly on the successful outcome of what locals now called the Mitchell Project. Sarah herself had changed as well, her grief for Thomas finding a more balanced place in her heart as new purpose filled her days. The children's books she had begun writing during the rehabilitation period had found a publisher, Her Simple Stories, about wildlife conservation, connecting with young readers far beyond Pinecrest Valley. 3 days each week, she volunteered with the education program at Whispering Pines Wildlife Center, sharing her experiences with school groups and helping care for animals undergoing rehabilitation. Yet despite these new directions, the wolves remained a significant presence in her thoughts. The tracking collars had long since degraded and fallen off as designed, but occasional reports from hikers and trail cameras confirmed their continued presence in the wider ecosystem. Frost had maintained his integration with the Clearwater Pack, eventually achieving a higher status position, though never becoming the alpha male. His distinctive hunting techniques, recognizable from behaviors developed during rehabilitation, had apparently influenced the broader pack, creating more efficient strategies that rangers documented with professional interest. Ember's path had proven more independent and, in some ways, more remarkable. After maintaining her solitary territory for nearly a year, she had formed a pair bond with a lone male wolf who had dispersed from a pack further north. Together, they established a new territory in the high country east of Cedar Falls, an area that had lacked resident wolves for decades. Trail cameras occasionally captured images of them moving together through the wilderness, their coordinated movements displaying the seamless communication characteristic of established wolf pairs. The mysterious food cache beneath the lightning struck pine had eventually ceased its regular activity, the structure gradually returning to natural materials as wind and weather reclaimed the site. Sarah had continued documenting it for several months after her encounter with Ember, providing detailed records to the research team before finally accepting the closure of that extraordinary chapter. The scientific papers mentioned the behavior as an anomaly worthy of further study, while carefully avoiding speculation about motivation or meaning beyond observable facts. As darkness settled over the snow-covered landscape, Sarah added final notes to her current project: an educational guide for older students about predator, conservation, and ecosystem management. The kitchen table that had once held emergency medical supplies for freezing wolf cubs now supported reference books about wildlife biology, conservation policy documents, and draft illustrations for her next children's book. Thomas's old medical journals had been joined by new volumes filled with Sarah's observations and experiences, creating a bridge between past and present that honored both. The satellite phone rang sharply, pulling her from deep concentration. Frank's voice came through with the static-laden urgency that accompanied storm communications. "Sarah, you're snowed in up there, right? Any chance of getting your truck out?" "Not without a snowplow," she replied, immediately alert to the tension in his tone. "What's happening?" "We've got a situation developing near Aspen Grove. Trail. Cameras picked up what looks like an injured wolf. Female, matching Ember's description as best we can tell. She's limping badly, having trouble navigating in the deep snow." Sarah's heart clenched at the image his words evoked. "How serious?" "Midaditi, hard to tell from the footage. Could be a minor injury that's worse because of the snow depth, or something more significant. Under normal conditions, we'd monitor remotely before deciding on intervention, but this storm system is intensifying. If she can't travel effectively, she's at risk of exposure over the next 48 hours. What about her mate? The cameras show him with her?" "That's the strange part," Frank said, his voice dropping slightly. "He's not visible in any of the recent footage. She appears to be alone, which is unusual given their consistent pair behavior over the past year. Dr. Winters is concerned there might have been a territorial conflict or another event that separated them." Sarah processed this information with the careful objectivity she had cultivated throughout the rehabilitation process. Ember was a wild wolf now, subject to the natural challenges and risks of wilderness life. The research protocols were clear about minimizing intervention unless absolutely necessary for conservation purposes or to prevent suffering when outcomes were certain. "What's the plan?" she asked, already knowing her own decision, but needing to understand the official response first. "Dr. Winters is stuck in Bozeman until the road's clear, probably 3 days minimum. I've got a team on standby, but we're dealing with multiple emergency situations across the county with this storm. Realistically, we can't reach Aspen Grove until tomorrow at the earliest, and that's if conditions don't worsen." The unspoken question hung between them, whether this situation warranted emergency prioritization given the multiple human needs competing for limited resources during the storm. Sarah understood the impossible calculus Frank faced as head ranger, weighing intervention for a single wild animal against the broader public safety mandate of his position. "Send me the coordinates and the camera footage," she said, decision crystallizing with clarity that surprised even her. "I can reach Aspen Grove on snowshoes from the North Trail. It's steep, but protected from the main wind." "Sarah," Frank's voice carried clear warning. "That's a 4-mile trek through heavy snow in near-blizzard conditions. It would be dangerous even for my trained rangers." "Who knows those trails better than I do?" she countered, already mentally inventorying the equipment she would need. "Thomas and I hiked them for 30 years. I've got proper gear, emergency supplies, and I can be there in 3 hours. If Ember needs help, every hour counts in these temperatures." The silence that followed contained Frank's internal struggle between protocol and practicality. When he spoke again, his tone carried reluctant acceptance. "I can't officially sanction this, you understand. But if you're determined to go, Won't waste time trying to stop you. Take the emergency radio. Channel 4 connects directly to dispatch. Check in every 30 minutes, and at the first sign the weather's worsening, you turn back immediately. Clear? Completely clear, Sarah confirmed, already moving to gather her cold weather gear from the mudroom storage. Send those coordinates as soon as possible. The preparations for winter wilderness travel followed patterns established through decades of mountain living. Sarah layered clothing carefully, moisture-wicking base layers beneath insulating wool, all protected by a windproof outer shell. Her emergency pack contained standard survival supplies, fire-starting materials, space blanket, high-calorie food bars, chemical heat packs, basic first aid kit, and additional communication devices, including a satellite emergency beacon. For Ember, she packed specialized equipment from the rehabilitation period, a collapsible transport sled, wolf-specific restraints designed for minimum stress, and sedative medications Dr. Winters had provided for emergency wildlife response. The satellite phone pinged with the promised coordinates, accompanied by a brief video clip from the trail camera. Sarah studied both carefully, confirming her mental map of the location and assessing Ember's condition from the grainy footage. The wolf moved with obvious difficulty, her right hind leg barely touching the ground as she navigated through snow, nearly reaching her belly. Despite the injury, her posture remained alert and her coat appeared healthy, positive signs that the injury might be recent rather than a degenerative condition. Strapping on her snowshoes at the cabin's back door, Sarah took a final moment to center herself in the reality of her mission. This was not an emotional rescue, but a practical conservation intervention, consistent with the rehabilitation philosophy that had guided their entire journey with these wolves. If Ember could recover without assistance, that remained the preferable outcome. Sarah's role was assessment first, intervention only, if absolutely necessary to prevent suffering or death. The night welcomed her with crystalline clarity, the storm having temporarily abated to leave a star-filled sky illuminating the snow-covered landscape with otherworldly brightness. Sarah's headlamp carved a focused path before her as she established a steady rhythm on the familiar trail, each step carefully placed in the deep powder. The silence pressed around her, broken only by the soft crunch of compressed snow beneath her snowshoes and her own measured breathing creating small clouds. In the frigid air, the forest gradually closed around her as the trail ascended toward Aspen Grove. Pine branches, heavy with snow, occasionally releasing their burdens in soft plumes of white powder. The physical exertion generated welcome warmth beneath her layers, though Sarah maintained careful awareness of her body temperature to prevent either overheating or excessive cooling, both dangerous in extreme winter conditions. Regular check-ins with Ranger Dispatch provided structure to the journey, marking her progress in measurable segments while ensuring emergency response could be activated if necessary. The storm remained mercifully stable, the predicted intensification, apparently delayed by changing pressure systems over the mountains. Sarah maintained her pace, conserving energy while covering ground with the efficient movement developed through years of wilderness experience. Approaching the coordinates required navigation away from established trails, following natural contours through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah paused to orient herself, comparing the GPS reading on her device with distinctive landscape features barely visible in the moonlight. The massive boulder formation, locally known as the Sentinels, confirmed she had reached the general vicinity of the camera sighting, though the exact location of the injured wolf remained uncertain. Standard tracking techniques proved challenging. In the deep snow, which obscured subtle signs that might indicate animal passage, Sarah methodically searched the area, sweeping her headlamp across the landscape while watching for any disruption in the pristine surface. After nearly 30 minutes of increasingly concentric circles, she found what she was seeking, a distinctive trail breaking the smooth contours of a small meadow, the indentations consistent with a large canid moving with irregular gait. Following, the trail required careful attention, as the tracks periodically disappeared where wind had swept snow across the passage. Sarah moved slowly but consistently, her focus absolute, as she traced the path through scattered trees and around fallen logs. The trail led toward a natural depression formed by several large boulders and a fallen pine, a sheltered location that would provide protection from wind and some insulation against the biting cold. The headlamp illuminated the space gradually, revealing first the disturbed snow at the entrance, then the darker recesses beneath the partial shelter. Sarah approached cautiously, maintaining appropriate distance for wildlife observation while trying to determine if the space was currently occupied. Movement in the shadows confirmed presence, accompanied by a low, warning growl that identified both species and temperament with unmistakable clarity. Sarah immediately stopped, switching her headlamp to its red light setting, less disturbing to wildlife while still providing sufficient illumination for assessment. From this distance, she could make out a dark form pressed against the rear of the natural shelter, golden eyes reflecting the light with the distinctive eyeshine of a canid. The posture was defensive, but not aggressive, suggesting wariness rather than immediate threat. Ember. Sarah spoke softly, using the name with no expectation of recognition, but as an acknowledgement of shared history. She remained motionless, allowing the wolf to process her presence without additional pressure or perceived threat. The growling subsided slightly, replaced by alert attention fixed on the human intruder. Sarah slowly removed her pack and extracted the thermal imaging device Dr. Winters had provided for wildlife assessment, switching it on with careful movements that avoided any suggestion of threat. The screen displayed heat signatures in the sheltered space, confirming not just one wolf, but multiple smaller forms clustered around the adult. Understanding dawned with startling clarity. Ember hadn't merely sustained an injury. She had given birth in the harshest season, producing a litter of pups at a time when most wolves would be months away from denning. The absence of her mate took on new significance in this context, suggesting possible tragedy that had left a new mother alone with vulnerable offspring during dangerous winter conditions. Sarah lowered the thermal device, reassessing the situation with this critical new information. A solitary injured wolf represented one type of conservation challenge. A mother with newborn pups created a far more complex scenario with immediate implications for the genetic diversity of the region's fragile wolf population. The pups' survival chances without intervention approached zero in current conditions, too young to regulate their own body temperature effectively, dependent on a mother whose injury compromised her hunting ability during a season of scarce prey. Consulting the emergency protocols developed with Dr. Winters for precisely such contingencies, Sarah carefully considered available options. Standard procedure would prioritize monitoring over intervention, allowing natural processes to unfold without human interference. Yet the exceptional circumstances, the storm, the injury, the unseasonable birth timing, and the absence of the mate, created conditions where intervention might be justified under conservation necessity. The decision crystallized with the same clarity that had guided her original rescue of the freezing cubs 2 years earlier. Sarah activated the satellite phone, connecting directly to Ranger Dispatch to update them on the discovered situation and request emergency consultation with any available wildlife specialists. While awaiting response, she began methodical preparation of the possible recovery options, arranging equipment for efficient access while maintaining non-threatening distance from the shelter. Dispatch connected her with a wildlife veterinarian from the State Conservation Department who had collaborated with Dr. Winters on previous projects. After reviewing the situation details, he confirmed Sarah's assessment. The combination of factors created justified cause for limited intervention under conservation guidelines, with the primary goal of ensuring survival of the genetic line represented by this new litter. Temperature control is your immediate priority, the veterinarian advised through the staticky connection. If the mother will tolerate your proximity, creating a microclimate within that natural shelter could stabilize the situation until we can arrange proper transport. Dr. Winters is attempting to reach you but remains weatherbound in Bozeman. With professional guidance supporting her instincts, Sarah began the delicate process of indirect intervention. Rather than attempting to handle either the mother or pups directly, an approach that would create unnecessary stress and potential aggression, she focused on environmental modification. Using emergency heat packs activated and wrapped in insulating material, she created thermal sources that could be placed near the shelter entrance without requiring direct intrusion into the wolves' space. Throughout this careful work, Sarah maintained constant verbal communication, not with any expectation of linguistic understanding, but as a non-threatening auditory presence that might reduce stress response. She spoke in the same calm, measured tone she had used during the rehabilitation period, a human voice that had once been associated with food and safety rather than danger. "You've created quite a situation here," she commented as she positioned another heat pack at the strategic distance, calculated to provide warming without threatening the mother's sense of security. Winter pups are quite the survival challenge, even without a storm and an injury complicating matters. The wolf's response evolved gradually over the hours that followed. The initial defensive growling subsided into watchful attention, then tentative tolerance, as Sarah's non-threatening movements established a pattern the mother could predict and assess. By the time the eastern sky began lightening with approaching dawn, Sarah had established a functional microclimate around the natural shelter, raising the ambient temperature to levels that would support newborn pup survival while allowing the mother appropriate space to attend to her offspring without human interference. Regular communication with Ranger Dispatch confirmed that an emergency response team had been assembled and would attempt to reach their location by mid-morning, weather permitting. The improved conditions would be temporary, sustainable for hours rather than days, but sufficient to bridge the gap until professional wildlife management resources could be deployed. As Sarah maintained her position at the calculated distance that balanced intervention with respect for wild boundaries, she reflected on the extraordinary symmetry of the situation. 2 winters ago, she had discovered freezing wolf cubs during a blizzard and made a choice that changed multiple lives, including her own. Now, one of those cubs, grown into a wild mother, faced similar life-threatening cold with her own offspring, creating another moment of critical decision at the intersection of human compassion and natural processes. Yet despite the surface similarities, profound differences characterized this second intervention. Sarah acted now, not from isolated individual judgment, but as part of a coordinated conservation effort, guided by scientific protocols and professional expertise. Her actions implemented established wildlife management principles rather than emotional response, though compassion remained a valid, motivating factor within the appropriate ethical framework. The wolf, watching her from the shelter, was no longer a vulnerable cub dependent on human care for survival, but a wild mother temporarily compromised by circumstance, yet retaining her essential wildness. The relationship between them had evolved, from caregiver-dependent to something more complex and balanced, mutual participants in an ecosystem where human and wildlife interests occasionally aligned despite fundamentally different existences. Dawn brought improved visibility and the first distant sounds of approaching vehicles, snowmobiles navigating the Forest Service roads that provided closest access to their remote location. Sarah maintained her position, continuing the established pattern of movement and voice that had created workable equilibrium with the wolf family. The thermal imaging confirmed the pups remained properly clustered for warmth, their heat signatures showing the vibrant glow of healthy young creatures despite their precarious circumstances. The wildlife response team arrived with impressive efficiency given the challenging conditions. 2 veterinarians from Whispering Pines Wildlife Center, accompanied by Frank, and 3 rangers equipped with specialized transport equipment. Sarah briefed them on the situation with professional concision, providing vital details about the mother's injury, the approximate number and condition of the pups, and the behavioral patterns observed during her overnight monitoring. "You've stabilized a nearly impossible situation," the lead veterinarian acknowledged after reviewing the arrangements Sarah had implemented. "This buys us critical time to develop a proper intervention strategy." That strategy emerged through careful consultation among the assembled experts, with Sarah's insights about Ember's specific history and behavior patterns providing valuable context for decision-making. Rather than attempting to separate mother from pups, an approach that would create maximum stress and potential for aggression, they developed a comprehensive plan to transport the entire family unit to a specialized facility where the mother's injury could be treated while maintaining her essential bond with the litter. The execution required precise coordination and respect for wolf behavior. Using sedative medication administered through a remote injection system, they induced mild sedation in the mother, sufficient to reduce stress and resistance without completely eliminating her awareness of her pups. The young were carefully gathered using handling techniques that minimized human scent transfer, placed in a temperature-controlled transport container with appropriate bedding materials that carried their mother's scent for security. Throughout the process, Sarah remained present but deliberately peripheral, understanding that her connection to this situation had fundamentally changed. Her role had shifted from primary responder to knowledgeable consultant, providing historical context and behavioral insights, while the wildlife professionals implemented appropriate protocols for the complex situation. The journey back to civilization followed carefully established routes, the specialized transport vehicles moving at measured pace to minimize stress on the sedated mother and vulnerable pups. Sarah traveled separately with Frank, providing additional details about Ember's rehabilitation history that might inform treatment approaches at the Wildlife Center. "You know, this creates a complicated scenario from a wildlife management perspective," Frank noted as they followed the transport vehicles down the mountain. "These pups will need specialized attention because of the winter birth timing, which means prolonged human contact during development." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. "Perfectly. Rehabilitation with intent to release, just like before. It can be done successfully. We proved that with Ember herself." "Different circumstances, though," Frank reminded her, "with their mother present rather than orphaned cubs. Makes the human-wildlife boundary even more complex to navigate." The observation captured the essence of the situation, a conservation challenge that defied simple categorization or resolution. The weeks that followed would bring detailed veterinary assessment of the mother's injury, a broken metatarsal likely caused by trap damage, serious but treatable with appropriate care. Genetic testing confirming Ember's identity beyond visual recognition, and the development of a specialized protocol for maintaining appropriate wolf family bonds, while minimizing problematic human associations during the puppy's critical developmental periods. Sarah remained involved throughout this process, though in a carefully defined advisory capacity rather than direct caregiver. Her experience with the original rehabilitation provided valuable insights for the Wildlife Center staff, while her documentation of Ember's developmental milestones created useful comparison points for assessing the pup's progress. Dr. Winters, upon finally reaching Pinecrest Valley after weather delays, integrated these historical records into a comprehensive management plan designed to give the wolf family maximum chance for eventual successful release. As winter gradually yielded to early spring, Sarah's direct involvement with the rehabilitation process appropriately diminished. The Wildlife Center provided regular updates on progress, Ember's healing injury, the pup's healthy development, the carefully structured program designed to maintain wild behaviors while providing necessary support during this vulnerable period. The ongoing situation became incorporated into the broader research documentation, with potential publications already being planned to capture the unprecedented multi-generational rehabilitation case study. On a mild April morning, Sarah stood on her cabin porch, watching early sunlight illuminate the Northridge Mountains with golden clarity. The snow had receded from south-facing slopes, though white still dominated the higher elevations and sheltered valleys. Birds had returned in growing numbers, their morning chorus creating complex harmonies that celebrated seasonal renewal. The satellite phone rang inside, its distinctive tone pulling her from contemplative observation. Dr. Winter's voice carried both professional satisfaction and genuine warmth when Sarah answered. "We've confirmed it through genetic testing," the biologist reported, without preamble. "The DNA analysis shows the pup's father was definitely from the Clearwater pack, Ember's brother's pack. The specific marker patterns suggest Frost himself as the most likely paternal match." Sarah absorbed this information with quiet wonder at the unexpected connection. Siblings mating, isn't that unusual in wild wolf populations? "Extremely," Dr. Winters confirmed. "Wolves typically have strong incest avoidance behaviors. In established packs, only the alpha pair breeds, and dispersing juveniles generally seek mates from different genetic lines. This kind of sibling pairing happens occasionally in very small, isolated populations with limited options, but it's genuinely rare in healthy ecosystems like ours." The implications settled between them, that something about Frost and Ember's shared experience, their unique developmental history, had created bonds that transcended typical wolf social patterns. Their rehabilitation had succeeded in returning them to wild, independent existence, yet the connection between them had evolved in ways that defied conventional wildlife management expectations. "The pups show no signs of genetic issues," Dr. Winters continued, addressing the unspoken concern. "They're developing normally, perhaps even ahead of standard benchmarks for their age. We're optimistic about eventually releasing the entire family unit, though the timeline will depend on Ember's continued recovery and appropriate behavioral development in the offspring." After the call ended, Sarah returned to her porch, watching springs advance across the landscape with renewed appreciation for nature's capacity to adapt and evolve beyond human expectations or categorization. The story that had begun with a desperate rescue during a blizzard had expanded into something far more complex, a multi-generational narrative of survival, adaptation, and unexpected connection that transcended simple definitions of success or failure in wildlife rehabilitation. The wolf family would find their way back to the wilderness when circumstances permitted, carrying forward genetic lines and behavioral adaptations shaped by their unique history. Sarah would continue her conservation work, applying lessons learned through this extraordinary journey to future efforts, protecting the delicate balance between human and wildlife interests in the mountain ecosystem. And somewhere in the forests surrounding Pinecrest Valley, the howls of wolves would continue echoing across ridgelines and valleys, some purely wild in lineage and experience, others carrying the subtle influence of human intervention in their history, all essential components of an ecosystem where boundaries between separate worlds occasionally blurred into something more complex and interconnected than either human science or natural instinct could fully explain. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.